The smoke had not yet cleared from the remnants of Florence Taylor's life when she found herself kneeling in the black soot, her hands covered in ash as she desperately searched for anything that might have survived the fire. Montana Territory, 1873, was unforgiving to those who stood alone, especially a woman whose husband had been buried just 3 months prior. Florence clutched a half-burned photograph to her chest, the only remnant of her husband Thomas that hadn't been consumed by the flames that took their modest homestead. At 26, she was already a widow, and now homeless. The dry summer wind whipped her auburn hair across her tear-stained face as she surveyed what remained of the 5 years they had spent building a life together. "Nothing left worth saving, madam," came a deep voice from behind her. Florence turned to see a tall man silhouetted against the setting sun. He sat atop a chestnut stallion, his broad shoulders framed by the Montana sky. The stranger removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached brown hair and eyes that reminded her of the clear creek water that ran through her property. "I reckon I can see that for myself," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "Who might you be?" "Jesse Owens, madam. I run cattle on the North Ridge." He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "Saw the smoke from my place. Came to see if anyone needed help." Florence brushed the ash from her skirts and stood, her pride the only possession she had left untouched by the fire. "Florence Taylor. And as you can see, Mr. Owens, I'm beyond help at the moment." Jesse surveyed the charred remains of the cabin. "How'd it start?" "Lightning. Hit during that storm last night. I was in town getting supplies." Her voice caught. "Everything I own was in there." Jesse nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. "You got folks nearby?" "No, my husband Thomas passed this spring, pneumonia." Florence felt her chin quiver but forced herself to maintain composure. "We came out here from Pennsylvania 5 years ago, no family for hundreds of miles." The cowboy's eyes softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Taylor." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them as the reality of her situation settled around them like the ash from her home. "You can't stay here tonight," Jesse finally said, gesturing toward the darkening sky. "My place is about an hour's ride. Got a spare room." "You're welcome to it until you figure things out," Florence bristled. "I hardly know you, Mr. Owens." A slight smile tugged at his lips. "That's fair enough. But your options are limited, Mrs. Taylor. The nearest town is half a day's ride and night's coming on fast." "I promise you'll be safe at my ranch." Florence looked at the remains of her home once more. The smoke had nearly dissipated, leaving only the skeleton of her former life. She thought about what Thomas would want her to do: stay safe, survive, keep going somehow. "I appreciate the offer," she finally conceded. "Just for tonight." Jesse nodded and led his horse closer. "Can I help you gather anything?" Florence clutched the photograph tighter. "This is all that's left." Without another word, Jesse extended his hand to help her onto his horse. Florence hesitated for only a moment before accepting his assistance, settling behind him on the saddle. As they rode away, Florence couldn't bear to look back at the smoldering ruins. Instead, she fixed her eyes on the horizon ahead, wondering what would become of her now. Jesse's ranch came into view just as the last light faded from the sky. Unlike many of the hastily constructed homesteads in the territory, his place spoke of permanence: a sturdy 2-story house built of thick logs, a large barn, and several well-maintained outbuildings. "You've done well for yourself, Mr. Owens," Florence remarked as they approached. "Been here 8 years. Started with nothing but 20 head of cattle and this plot of land." There was no pride in his voice, just simple fact. "Built it all myself, piece by piece." As they dismounted, an older woman emerged from the house, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Mrs. Pierce," Jesse called. "This is Mrs. Taylor. Her place burned down today. She'll be staying with us tonight." The woman's stern face softened immediately. "Lord have mercy, child." Come in. You must be exhausted." Florence followed Mrs. Pierce into the house while Jesse took care of his horse. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, simple furnishings but clean and well kept. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the smell of something savory filled the air. "I'm Jesse's housekeeper," Mrs. Pierce explained as she guided Florence to a chair at the kitchen table. "Been with him since he built this place. You sit right there and I'll fetch you some stew." Too weary to protest, Florence sank into the chair. The events of the day crashed over her in waves. She had lost everything again. First Thomas, now their home and all their belongings. She stared at her ash-covered hands, feeling utterly adrift. Jesse entered, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Mrs. Pierce makes the best venison stew this side of the Mississippi," he said, taking a seat across from Florence. "You should eat something." The housekeeper placed a steaming bowl in front of Florence along with a chunk of fresh bread. Despite her distress, her stomach rumbled at the aroma. "Thank you," she murmured. Realizing she hadn't eaten since early morning, they ate in silence, the weight of Florence's situation hanging over the table. When she'd finished, Mrs. Pierce showed her to a small but comfortable bedroom upstairs. "There's water for washing," the older woman said, pointing to a basin. "And I've left a nightgown on the bed. It's one of mine, so it might be a bit large, but it's clean." Florence's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "You're very kind," Mrs. Pierce patted her hand. "Get some rest, dear. Things have a way of looking different in the morning light." Alone in the room, Florence finally allowed her tears to fall freely. She washed the ash from her skin and changed into the borrowed nightgown, then sat on the edge of the bed, staring at Thomas's photograph. What was she to do now? She had a little money saved, but not enough to rebuild. She had no skills that would earn her a living in town. For the first time since Thomas's death, Florence felt truly lost. Morning came too quickly. Florence had slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of fire and loss. She dressed in her ash-stained clothes from the previous day, the only garments she now possessed, and made her way downstairs. Jesse sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, studying what looked like a ledger. He looked up when she entered. "Mrs. Taylor. Hope you managed some sleep." "Some," she admitted. "Mr. Owens, I appreciate your hospitality, but I should be on my way." He closed the ledger. "And where exactly will you go?" The question stopped her short. She had no answer. "I thought as much," Jesse said, not unkindly. "Sit down. Have some coffee." Mrs. Pierce bustled in with a plate of eggs and bacon, placing it in front of Florence without asking if she wanted it. "Eat," the housekeeper ordered. "Can't think straight on an empty stomach." Florence sat and took a sip of the coffee Mrs. Pierce poured for her. It was strong and hot, exactly what she needed. "I've been thinking," Jesse began. "My foreman left last month, headed to California with gold fever. I've been trying to run this place and do his work too. It's too much." Florence looked at him quizzically. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't see I need help, Mrs. Taylor. Someone to manage the books, oversee supplies, handle correspondence, the business side of ranching." Jesse leaned forward. "I'm offering you a job." Florence nearly choked on her coffee. "A job, me?" "Thomas mentioned you were educated, said you kept all his accounts." Florence was startled. "You knew my husband?" Jesse nodded. "Not well. Met him in town a few times. He spoke highly of you, said you had a head for numbers better than any banker he'd met." It was true. Florence had attended school longer than most women her age, and she had managed all the financial aspects of their homestead. Thomas had often joked that she could have run a bank if women were allowed such positions. "I need someone I can trust," Jesse continued. "You need a place to stay and work. Seems like a solution for both of us." Florence considered his offer. The thought of working for wages was foreign to her. She had gone from her father's house to her husband's, always dependent on a man's provision. Yet the idea of earning her own way held a certain appeal. What exactly would this position entail? You'd keep the books, order supplies, pay the men, handle correspondence with buyers. "I've got 15 hands working for me now, and the operation's growing." You'd have your own room here in the main house, fair wages, 1 day off a week. "And what would people say? A widow living in a bachelor's home?" Jesse gestured toward Mrs. Pierce, who was pretending not to listen as she scrubbed a pot. "Mrs. Pierce lives here, has since I built the place." She's as respectable a chaperone as they come. Besides, this is the frontier. People have more pressing concerns than gossip. Florence knew that wasn't entirely true. Gossip was sometimes the only entertainment available in these parts, but she also knew her options were severely limited. I would need to go into town, get some clothes, personal items, Jesse nodded. We'll go today. Consider it an advance on your wages. And so Florence Taylor found herself in a new life with startling swiftness. Her position at the Owens ranch proved to be exactly as Jesse had described. She kept the accounts in perfect order, wrote letters to cattle buyers in Denver and Cheyenne, managed the payroll for the ranch hands, and ordered supplies with an efficiency that saved the operation considerable money. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of a woman in a position of authority, soon came to respect her no-nonsense approach and fair dealing. Mrs. Pierce, though gruff, became something of a surrogate mother, teaching Florence the routines of the ranch house and offering quiet companionship in the evenings. As for Jesse, he was often away from the house, working from dawn until dusk with his men. When their paths crossed, their interactions were polite but limited to ranch business. Florence found him to be fair, hardworking, and surprisingly well-read for a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. Summer turned to fall, and Florence found herself settling into a routine that, while not what she had envisioned for her life, provided a sense of purpose she had been lacking since Thomas's death. She still mourned her husband and the life they'd built together, but the sharp edges of grief began to soften as days passed. One evening in late October, Florence was working late in the small office Jesse had set aside for her use. The ranch's profits had increased substantially since she'd taken over the books, largely due to her careful management of expenses and her knack for negotiating better prices with buyers. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't hear Jesse enter until he spoke. "You're working too hard," he said, causing her to start. Florence looked up to find him standing in the doorway, a cup of coffee in each hand. He crossed the room and placed one on her desk. "Thank you," she said, surprised by the gesture. "Just finishing the quarterly accounts." "We've done well this season." "We have," Jesse agreed, taking a seat across from her. "Thanks in large part to you." Florence felt a flush of pleasure at his acknowledgement. "I'm just doing my job. You're doing far more than that." Jesse took a sip of his coffee. "The ranch is running smoother than it ever has. The men respect you. Mrs. Pierce actually smiles occasionally, and he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've come to value your presence here more than I expected." Something in his tone made Florence look at him more closely. In the lamplight, his face appeared softer than usual, the lines around his eyes less pronounced. For the first time, she noticed the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Jesse continued. "Winter's coming on fast. Have you given any thought to what you'll do about your land?" The question brought Florence back to reality. She had visited her property only twice since the fire, finding it too painful to stand among the ashes of her former life. "Not really," she admitted. "I can't afford to rebuild, and I'm not sure I would want to anyway. Too many memories." Jesse nodded thoughtfully. "You could sell it. Land's valuable even without structures." "Perhaps," Florence agreed, though the thought of selling the place she and Thomas had loved so dearly felt like another betrayal of his memory. "Or," Jesse said slowly, "you could plant it, come spring." Florence looked at him quizzically. "Plant it with what?" "Wheat, barley. Maybe even some vegetables. This territory needs more than just cattle. Folks are moving in, building towns. They need food." "I know nothing about farming on that scale." "I do." Jesse set down his cup. "My pa was a farmer before he was a rancher, taught me everything he knew. I could help you." Florence studied him, trying to understand his motivation. "Why would you do that?" Jesse held her gaze steadily. "Because I think you deserve a chance to build something again, something that's yours." His words touched something deep inside her, a place that had been dormant since the fire, perhaps even since Thomas's death. The idea of creating rather than just surviving sparked a flicker of hope she hadn't expected to feel again. "I'll think about it," she promised. Jesse nodded, satisfied. "That's all I ask." He rose to leave but paused at the door. "You know, Florence, life has a way of burning things down so new growth can begin. Sometimes the most fertile ground is found in the ashes." After he left, Florence sat motionless, turning his words over in her mind. For the first time since she'd begun working at the ranch, Jesse had called her by her given name. More surprising was how right it had sounded coming from his lips. As winter descended on the Montana territory, the ranch settled into its cold weather routines. The cattle were moved to sheltered pastures, preparations were made for potential blizzards, and the main house became a haven of warmth against the bitter cold outside. Florence found herself spending more time in Jesse's company as the shortened days kept him closer to home. They often sat by the fire in the evenings, Jesse reading from one of the many books he'd collected over the years, Florence mending or working on a quilt Mrs. Pierce had taught her to make. Sometimes they talked about books, about the ranch, about the future of the territory. Jesse spoke of his dream to expand his operation, to raise horses as well as cattle. Florence shared her growing interest in possibly planting crops on her land come spring. What remained unspoken was the growing connection between them, a friendship that seemed to be evolving into something more with each passing day. The change in their relationship became apparent to Florence on Christmas Eve. Mrs. Pierce had outdone herself preparing a feast and even invited the ranch hands to join them in the main house for the meal. The atmosphere was festive despite the howling wind outside, with plenty of food, music from a fiddle played by one of the Cowboys, and even a small gift exchange. After the men had returned to their bunkhouse and Mrs. Pierce had retired, Florence found herself alone with Jesse by the fire. To her surprise, he handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Just something I picked up last time I was in Helena," Jesse said, a hint of nervousness in his voice that she'd never heard before. Florence carefully unwrapped the package to find a small leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with an intricate design of wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the soft leather. "Thought you might like to write down those ideas you have for your land," Jesse explained. "Plans for the future." Florence looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, of the firelight playing across his features, softening the weathered edges of his face. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm afraid I don't have anything for you." Jesse shook his head. "You've given more than enough, Florence. This ranch hasn't run this well since." "Well, ever. Still, I wish. There is one thing," Jesse interrupted, his voice low. "If you're of a mind to give it." Florence felt her heart quicken. "What's that?" Instead of answering, Jesse leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he brushed his lips against hers in a kiss so gentle it might have been imagined. When he drew back, uncertainty clear in his eyes, Florence made a decision. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, then leaned in to return his kiss with one of her own. Less hesitant than his had been, when they finally parted, Jesse rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since July," he admitted with a soft laugh. "Why didn't you?" Florence asked, her hand still resting against his cheek. "Didn't seem right. You were grieving, still are, I expect." Florence considered his words. "I will always love Thomas," she said honestly. "He was a good man and a good husband, but he's gone and I'm still here. I think he would want me to be happy." "And does this make you happy?" Jesse asked, his vulnerability evident. In answer, Florence kissed him again, allowing herself to feel the warmth and promise of something she had thought lost to her forever. As winter gradually released its grip on the land, Florence and Jesse's relationship deepened. They moved cautiously, both aware of the potential complications. Florence still worked for Jesse, after all, and the social conventions of the time frowned upon such arrangements, frontier or not. Yet neither could deny the growing affection between them. They began taking rides together on Sundays, exploring the land that surrounded the ranch. Jesse showed her hidden valleys and pristine streams, places of such beauty that Florence found herself falling in love not just with the man but with the territory itself, in a way she hadn't during her years of hard work on her own homestead. On one such ride in early March, they visited Florence's land for the first time together. The charred remains of her cabin had been partially covered by winter snows, but as the thaw began, they were becoming visible once more. Florence dismounted, walking slowly among the ruins. Jesse gave her space, sensing her need to confront this part of her past. "I thought it would be harder," she said after a while, turning to look at him. "Coming back here, but it's just a place now. The memories are still with me, but they don't hurt the same way." Jesse nodded, understanding in his eyes. Land has a way of healing itself, so do people. Florence surveyed the clearing, seeing it with new eyes. "You were right about planting. This soil is good. With some work, it could yield a fine crop. You thinking about it seriously then?" Florence nodded. "I am. I could start small, a few acres, see how it goes." Jesse smiled, clearly pleased. "I'll help my men too when they can be spared." "I can pay them," Florence began, but Jesse shook his head. "No need. Neighbors help neighbors out here. It's how we all survive." Florence looked at him sharply. "Is that what we are? Neighbors?" Jesse approached her slowly, taking her hands in his. "I hope we're more than that, Florence. A lot more." The air between them seemed to still as Jesse continued. "I know it hasn't been that long since Thomas. I know you're still finding your way. But I've never met a woman like you, strong enough to face down whatever life throws at you, smart enough to run circles around any man I know, and kind enough to see the good in folks even when they don't deserve it." Florence felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Jesse, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not asking for any promises today, just want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. And in the meantime, I'll help you plant these fields and watch things grow. Including us, if that's what you want." Florence looked around at her land, at the ashes of her past, and the fertile ground that promised a future. Then she looked at Jesse, this man who had come into her life when she had nothing left but her determination to survive. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like very much to see what might grow between us." Jesse's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He pulled her close, sealing their tentative agreement with a kiss that spoke of possibilities neither had dared hope for just months earlier. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Jesse taught Florence everything he knew about farming: how to test the soil, how to prepare the ground for planting, which crops would grow best in the Montana climate. They ordered seeds, purchased the necessary equipment, and made plans for the planting that would begin as soon as the ground had fully thawed. Meanwhile, their relationship continued to develop. They were discreet, mindful of Florence's position at the ranch, but Mrs. Pierce's knowing smiles suggested they weren't fooling anyone. The ranch hands treated Florence with the same respect as always, perhaps with an added touch of protective deference that came from recognizing her importance to their boss. April arrived with warming temperatures and occasional rain showers that promised good conditions for planting. Jesse arranged for several of his men to help prepare Florence's land, clearing the remains of her cabin and turning the soil in the areas they had marked for cultivation. Florence threw herself into the work, finding unexpected joy in the physical labor and the promise of creation it represented. Each evening she would return to the ranch exhausted but fulfilled, recording the day's progress in the journal Jesse had given her for Christmas. It was during one of these work sessions, as Florence and Jesse were marking out rows for the wheat they planned to plant the following day, that Jesse suddenly dropped to one knee beside her. Thinking he had stumbled, Florence reached out to help him up. "Are you all right?" "Never better," Jesse replied, looking up at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In his hand was a simple gold ring. "Florence Taylor, I know we haven't known each other long in the counting of days, but in the ways that matter, I feel I've known you all my life." Florence's hand flew to her mouth. "Jesse, I'm asking you to be my wife, not my employee, not my neighbor, but my partner in everything. To build something together that's stronger than either of us could make alone." Florence looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, this man who had appeared in her darkest hour and had helped her find light again. She thought of Thomas, of the love they had shared, and knew with certainty that he would approve of the choice she was about to make. "Yes," she said simply, holding out her hand. Jesse slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into an embrace that lifted her off her feet. Their laughter echoed across the fields they had prepared together, fields that would soon burst with new life. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Mrs. Pierce beaming like a proud mother and the ranch hands serving as witnesses. The local minister pronounced them husband and wife under a canopy of spring blossoms, and Florence found herself beginning a chapter of life she had never expected to write. As spring turned to summer, the wheat fields on Florence's land now, their land grew tall and golden under the Montana sun. The crop would be small this first year, but it was just the beginning. Jesse had already drawn up plans to expand the planting next season, adding barley and perhaps even an apple orchard in the years to come. Florence continued to manage the books for the ranch, but now as an equal partner rather than an employee. Together, she and Jesse built a new cabin on her land larger and sturdier than the one that had burned, with plenty of room for the family they hoped to have. On the anniversary of the fire that had destroyed her home, Florence stood with Jesse on the porch of their new cabin, looking out over the rippling wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon. "A year ago today, I thought my life was over," she said quietly. "I had lost everything twice over, first Thomas, then our home." Jesse slipped his arm around her waist. "And now," Florence turned to face him, placing her hand on her slightly rounded belly where their first child was growing. "Now I know that life doesn't end with loss, it just changes course. You taught me that, Jesse Owens. You showed me how to plant seeds for tomorrow when all I could see were the ashes of yesterday." Jesse placed his hand over hers, his eyes reflecting the same wonder and joy that filled her heart. "We planted those seeds together, Florence. And we'll harvest what grows from them the same way, side by side, for all the days were given." As the setting sun cast long shadows across their fields, Florence leaned into her husband's embrace, grateful for the fire that had destroyed her world, and the man who had helped her build a new one from the ashes, a world filled with love, hope, and the promise of all the seasons yet to come.